Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the QI Podcast. I am your host, DJ 10th Power. Special shout out to our producers, Angry Bill Productions, the bullies I call them. I also want to thank you, our watchers, for tuning in. I want to give a special shout out to our listeners who check us out on audio in the different countries. Of course, the good old listeners here in the US of A, United Kingdom, India, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, the British Crown Dependency Channel Island of Jersey, and Norway. Thank you all for tuning in to the QI Podcast. Now on to our next episode with Susan Rogers. The thing I like most about talking with Susan Rogers before we even got into the conversation was that I knew I was going to get a gazillion stories and that all of it was going to be truthful and that all of it was going to be interesting, and she did not disappoint. On to part 2 of the QI Podcast conversation with Susan Rogers. I've read somewhere, I can't remember where, that usually his first single was usually the last song that he wrote for his album. Was this true for, I think that was true for When Doves Cry was the last song that he wrote for Purple Rain. Was this true with Kiss and Around the World and the soundtrack, Parade?
No, I think Kiss happened somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit later on in the process. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily the last song because the notion of his albums at that time were different from a lot of people. Now, a lot of people, they come off the tour, they set aside some time just to write and to demo their next batch of songs. And when they go into the studio to make an album, they have a sense of what songs are going to be on it. So you demo it first, you go into the studio and you make your album. When you're done making the album, poof, we're done. You take a little break and then you start rehearsing for the tour and you go out on tour and you don't think about writing again until it's time to make your next record. That's how most people do it. Not Prince. He was always writing and recording. He wrote and recorded while we were in rehearsal, while we were on tour, while he's making movies, constantly. So you never knew for sure where an album started and stopped, or when an album started and stopped, because he's always making material. Every so often, he'd have a concept for what his next record might be, and we would sequence side A and side B, some of the songs he'd been working on at the time, and he'd live with it for a little while to see, is this my next record or isn't it? When I say a concept, I mean, what's going to be the lyrical theme in this record? What does he want people to know about him? What's going to be the aesthetic? Is it going to be, well, will the color scheme be purple like it was on Purple Rain? Or kind of purple like it was on Controversy in 1999? Or for Around the World in a Day, he's bored of that. Now it's a whole rainbow color scheme. For the Parade album, it's black and white. So these concepts mattered to him, and that's why making an album involved choosing which songs did he want, which songs shared what he wanted the public to know about him. They weren't necessarily his best songs or even his best performance. I have said publicly, and I think this is true, he chose songs for his album based on their lyrical content, and everything else just went in the vault. So things like She's Always in My Hair, Splash, I loved Splash, Empty Room, In a Large Room with No Light. I mean, countless incredible titles that ended up in the vault. They were in the vault because largely it wasn't what he felt like saying at that time.
Yeah, I read that he felt that his music should, even if he's not here, that his music that was in the vault should all eventually be released to the world because it's there for them to hear. Whereas other people may be a little bit more protected. Hey, if I didn't release it, I don't want the world to hear. Do you know why his thinking was like that? Like, I don't care, let them all hear it.
Yeah. I did not read that from him or hear that from him anywhere, but I have come to believe, after doing serious, careful thinking about it, that of course he would have wanted his vault material to be released. Because if he didn't want you to hear something, he would destroy it, as he did with the original recording of the song Wally. If he didn't want you to hear it, you weren't going to hear it. And he instructed me to erase the tape. So anything else that ended up in that vault is, I believe, it's material that he was proud of. Now, sometimes what he would do is if we were working on something and he really didn't like it, he'd hold up 3 fingers like this, and that meant weak. And when something was weak, that was the worst thing he could say about something, is that it was weak. And he'd have me, when I saw the 3 fingers, it meant take a Sharpie and on the tape box, make a big W and put a circle around it. Weak. So sometimes we'd pull things out of the vault and he'd say, this track is weak. Do this. Mark it. But that didn't mean he was ashamed of it. It meant he'd leave it in the vault and maybe he'd get inspiration from it and use it for something else. The case in point, Slow Love on the Sign of the Times album, that was pulled out of the vault. I Could Never Take the Place of Your Man, that was pulled out of the vault. There's a lot of stuff, great stuff. It was just sitting in there till he was ready for it.
I've read that he can write songs like it's nothing. Just give him a pen and a pad.
Yeah.
And, have you ever been around? Could you share a story where you might have seen him put together a song and be blown away by it and go in and record it immediately?
Yeah, that's he at that time. Sessions would kind of start one of 2 ways. So in some cases, he would have been up late at night writing a song on piano or guitar, and he'd have the lyrics. And he'd come into the studio with the lyrics on a piece of paper. He knew the chord progression, he knew the melody, and he'd tell you, here's the instrumentation I want. He'd usually tell me in advance so that I'd get to the studio, I'd set everything up for him, and then he could move either through acoustic drums or electronic drums or whatever it was he was going to do. He would get through to do this song that he had written. That was usually the case for some of the ballads and some of his more pop songs. But the way the majority of songs went is that he just came into the studio with maybe just an idea for a groove, and he'd get started on the drum machine. A lot of the dance stuff went like that. It was actually just get a rhythm going first. He'd mess around with the drum machine. He'd add a bass part. Then he would add the rest of the rhythm parts, rhythm guitar and keyboard parts. Then he would make a cassette of it. He'd take the cassette, and he liked going into the car with his notepad, and he'd play the cassette in the car with his notepad, and he'd come back in a couple of hours later having written lyrics for it. So he'd come in, he'd have the lyrics, he'd have me set up a vocal mic, or actually I would have set up the vocal mic before he got back, so it was all ready for him to go. And that's when he'd add the lyrics then. So sometimes he came in with songs, and other times he just came in with snippets, just ideas, and he had to go away and write the lyrics.
I hear that he kept incredible timing in the studio that nobody could understand. I mean, I still can't understand or get blown away by knowing that he played every instrument on certain songs or all of the songs, and then the band comes in and learns it for the tour or whatever, or they might have participated in some of the recordings. But that had to be kind of a tedious process. He'd go play the drums, then how would he start? Would he start with the drums and then move to bass and then to guitar? Or?
Yeah, and he had such a genius arranger's mind, I mean genius, that he knew with the 24 tracks of the tape machine, he knew what instrumentation he wanted. And he knew, it's almost as if this was such a spooky thing about it. It was as if he could hear the song fully finished in his head as we're coming together. And he could easily, if it was drum machine, he'd take that LM1 drum machine, program a measure or 2, and then you'd just stripe it onto the tape. And then later, after the arrangement of the song was totally etched in stone, you'd go in and you could erase certain snare hits, or you can add additional fills or things like that, just to demarcate sections. But when it came to acoustic drums, if he had his lyrics written in advance, we'd tape the lyrics to a mic stand in front of the drum kit. And this is like mind-blowingly great. Very few people can do this. But he would, with the lyrics in front of him on a mic stand, he'd get at the drum kit and play the entire song on an acoustic kit. No headphones, no click, just play the song the way the song goes. Every fill, every break. A perfect example is The Cross on the Sign of the Times album. Tambourine on Around the World in a Day. I mean, that's just the stuff that he did.
Transitioning from the Parade album to Sign of the Times, it seemed like he went back to the basics. You started hearing the live instrumentation again, and he didn't realize. So there's still some songs where he used drum machines, but what made him, I'm assuming some of those recordings were done in advance as he was doing all the other albums, but what made him kind of go back to that sound in Sign of the Times like he had in Controversy and his earlier albums?
Well, now bear in mind that right around that time, the Revolution had just disbanded, and he had a new band, and that was Sheila's band, and they were from Oakland. Now, for your listeners, excuse me a second, I gotta get water. Music has regional character, and Wendy and Lisa were a big part of Prince's sound in the Revolution, but they sounded like LA because both of their dads were LA musicians. They were LA. They had that LA sensibility. Sheila and her band had that East Bay, Oakland, Grease, as they called it, sensibility. They were a harder, tougher band. So in order to make a record that was going to serve their talents on tour, Prince needed to think a little bit differently about the instrumentation and the arrangements because it had to show off his new band. So there's more horns. Eric Leeds and Atlanta Bliss is what he called him, but Matt Bliston on trumpet. More horns and drum parts that would serve Sheila E. a lot better because she was such an amazing drummer. So that's why his sound changed a little bit, because without Wendy and Lisa on the stage next to him, he wasn't going to get that unique thing that they brought with them in his band.
The breakup, when I learned about the breakup, I was so crushed. Do you know, or could you share the reason why he decided to break it off?
Oh, you know, it's I'm currently reading a book, biography of Frank Sinatra, and there are parallels there. Frank would often leave people before they could leave him, and never wanting to be too committed to anybody, just never wanting to be dependent on anyone. Certainly Prince had some of those qualities. He was loyal and faithful, but if he found himself depending on you, it scared him a little bit. And as some evidence of that is he had 2 marriages and neither one lasted very long. And a lot of folks in that position, in that rock star position, do have problems with trust and with dependency, depending on others. And I think that he was starting to feel a little bit of that. I think he was starting to feel maybe he was a little too close to his band, and maybe they were too much an integral part of his business and his music. And I think he started feeling the itch, and that started coming out in the way he treated people in his band, and then they started feeling it, and so they thought, okay, well, I'm going to leave you before you can leave me. And so there was a little bit of division in the ranks. And remember, we were all young people. Young people don't know too much about permanence at that time. We don't know a good thing when we've got it. We don't know how to predict the future that well. So yeah, it split apart. In hindsight, maybe it shouldn't have, but I don't see how it could have gone any other way.
What made you finally say, okay, I need to step away? You're known as the person being there during his string of biggest albums.
Yeah.
Made you, step away from that? Especially, it was after the Sign of the Times album, or
yeah.
What made you say, okay, I've had enough?
Well, it was an unsustainable pace. If you're jogging or exercising, you can do amazing things for a short while, but you will run out of fuel. And that's kind of what was happening. I really was, I missed the girls. I missed Wendy and Lisa. I was close with them. And I missed Susanna because she left shortly after Wendy and Lisa did. And so the people who I used to commiserate with, the girls I used to hang with, they were there, and now they were gone. And I didn't feel the way it had felt 4 years ago. It's amazing that that much work happened in 4 years, but it was no longer feeling the same. I was feeling it, he was feeling it, and the main thing that happened that caused our split was that Paisley Park Studios finally opened its doors in 1987. And when Paisley Park Studios opened, that meant that he didn't have to work the way he had when we recorded at rehearsals and we recorded at his home studio. He didn't need a technician in the engineering chair. You got a whole tech room there for Sal Greco and other technicians. You've got assistant engineers. You've got multiple studios right there in Chanhassen. So his methodology, his way of working could change. So it was kind of the perfect time. We reached an impasse and kind of agreed, like, I think our plane has landed.
Was it painful?
It was poignant. I don't know about painful, but it was poignant. I've said this elsewhere, so I can go ahead and say it here. What happened was, I was in Los Angeles working on, I was doing post-production mixing for the Sign of the Times concert film, and he was at home at Paisley Park doing the second Madhouse album. The guy who was the technician who was helping me do post-production on that movie was a guy who was single. I was single. We were attracted to each other, and one night I went on a date, which I hadn't done in over 4 years. But I went on a date, and Prince, this is before, cell phones, he couldn't reach me. I wasn't at the studio and I wasn't at the hotel. He got on a plane and came out to Los Angeles. And the next morning, after he couldn't reach me, I went to the sound stage where we were doing post-production, and he was there already waiting. This was early, like 9 o'clock in the morning. He was waiting, and he just pointed at me, and he pointed at an empty vocal booth and said, "You, me, talk." And we went in the booth, and kind of the funny thing was it kind of ended the way it began. I told you the story about shaking his hand and speaking with him, not employer-employee, but human to human. And we had another one of those conversations, human to human. And he was saying, "I tried to reach you last night. Where were you?" And I said, "I was out." And he said, "You can't do that." Essentially, he was saying, "I need to always be able to reach you." And I was kind of saying back to him, that can only last for so long.
I gotta have a life.
Right. And it was poignant. It was sad because we realized, like I said, our plane had landed. We're at the end of the road. He needed something, and he had every right to need it. I needed something and had every right to need it. And those two things had reached the end of their compatibility.
I have, you brought up Sign of Times post-production. Why did he choose, I don't know if he's the one that made the decision, but why did he choose so much overdubbing in the vocal? And it seemed like maybe even with the band, I'm not sure, but it just seemed that he didn't trust what the cameras caught. So it became kind of obvious to me that stuff kind of wasn't lining up, and that maybe I'm listening to, overdubbing or post-production work.
Actually, what ended up happening on that is he decided to do this movie very last minute. I mean, last minute. We had like 48 hours notice to get a film crew and everything to do these shows. The audio quality was good. We had a good mobile truck from Germany. The audio quality was fine, but the problem was the visual quality was not. The camera work, the lighting, we just didn't have enough time to do it properly, and it looked grainy, and it didn't look very good. He didn't have the close-ups he wanted. So when we came back off tour and we were at the Paisley Park soundstage, he decided to overdub the film, not the audio, but the film. So we used the existing audio from that concert tour and shot new scenes at the Paisley Park soundstage, trying to make it look like it was this place in the Netherlands. a big arena, the Ahoy Arena in the Netherlands. So that's basically what happened is we reshot the concert footage so that it would look better at home at Paisley Park. And it did look better. But yeah, he was in a transition period, and it's amazing that Sign of the Times is considered a masterpiece because artists in a transition period usually don't do their best work, much less a masterpiece. But he was transitioning out of the sound of the revolution, out of the sound that had made him popular. He was transitioning out of his 20s. He was now 30 years old, and he used to write lyrics from a young man's perspective. He's a man now, a man who should be thinking about marriage or children or something because he's transitioning into a new phase in his life. So some of his decisions were not well advised, but they were those instinctual decisions just to see that something was going to work.
What do you feel in that 4-year period was your greatest achievement in working with Prince?
Oh, easy. Just being able to hang. I could hang. And that was a point of pride with me. Like, and to a fault, actually. I remember one time he was upset at me, and I was just barely managing to make something work, and he just turned and looked at me and he said, "Get some help. I've got lots of money. Hire some help." But I had this weird, sense of pride. Like if he needs it done, if he can push himself that hard, I can push myself that hard, and then I could match him in terms of the effort that I would put in to the work. And I think he liked that. He liked that. He said so in his roundabout way more than once. So I think the greatest thing I did with him was, damn, I hung in there. I worked really hard, and I'm proud. I did, when I look back at it now, really kind of phenomenal things in terms of my capacity to stay awake and be productive and be right there with him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was it by a long shot.
I saw one interview, and one thing I drew from it in listening to you is that you're very protective of the work that you've done with Prince. And you won't allow people, I feel, to insult him or his work in any kind of way. And I was like, yes, I love this about you. And that's when I realized I got to reach out and see if I can have a conversation with her. You're very protective of Prince and the work that you've done with him.
Right. He was a taskmaster. He expected so much from people. He was socially, he deliberately isolated himself. I suppose insulated is the better word, not isolated. He was around other people, but he insulated himself. He wouldn't let you get close to him. But down deep inside, you knew that he had a warm and loving heart. That was obvious. He was kind. He was generous. And he was on some level easy to love. When I think of his primary characteristic, the thing that stands out to me is his courage. It takes courage to separate yourself from your friends and your family, to be their boss, to have this life, to actually achieve your potential. You have to give up so much. You have to give up so much. When I think about him in those days, he was a young man. Imagine being 25 years old, and all the people you see day in and day out, the people you consider your closest friends, get a paycheck from you. Everyone you see is paid by you. So how do you look people in the face and have a real conversation with them? You're their boss. How this kid pulled this off, and in such a commendable way. He didn't do what many rock stars do, get involved with bacchanalia or all horrible things. He was a good man, an ethical man, a moral man. And how one young man from North Minneapolis can carry all of that, plus his talent. Go ahead, anybody else. Go ahead and try doing the same thing. Of course, he wasn't perfect, but damn, he worked hard at it.
You mentioned his generosity. Can you share a story with us about something he might have done? I know that I remember seeing a long time ago in a magazine that he did a concert for kids that were deaf, I believe it was. Can you share a story with us about his
Yes.
generosity?
Now, that's one that I was there for, so I believe that there were quite a few others as well. But we were on the Purple Rain tour, and he wanted to play for Gallaudet. Gallaudet was a it was in
University of DC.
Yes, yes,
University of DC.
it was for children with developmental delays, and it was also, I believe, I should look this up so that I know for sure, but I believe that they did medical research there as well. So basically, it was a place for kids who were not going to be able to come out and see the Purple Rain show. Mm-hmm. And so in the day, during the daytime, we had a second truck right there with all the rest of our gear that had a second set of gear in it, extra drum machine, extra guitars, extra amps, all extra microphones, all that kind of stuff. And we kept it there packed for after shows and also for recording on the road, right? So we wouldn't have to touch our main gear. So anyway, we just took that truck over there to Gallaudet and set up in there. It was kind of a cafeteria, as I remember, but there was a little stage there, a low stage, and we set up the way we would for a show at home. I mean, we had the riser, we had the scarves, we had the flowers, we had the mask. I mean, we really dolled it up. Now this room, this cafeteria, picture like a school cafeteria, was filled with kids, little kids, many of them in wheelchairs, and you said, oh, these kids, many of them developmentally delayed. They were all there, filling the room, and their caretakers were there in the back of the room. Prince did that show, and we did a full set. He did that show on the condition that no press be there. He didn't want the credit. He didn't want cameras there. Like he wanted to play to the kids. He wanted it to be for the kids. That was the condition he established, because that's what he wanted. That was his reward, is to play for those kids. He didn't want the publicity or the credits. He didn't want a halo around his head. He wanted to play for his kids. And he did things like that all the time. I learned after I left his employ, the work that he put into behind the scenes on the condition of anonymity to help struggling young artists whom he admired, to help keep them afloat until they could have a hit record, to help keep them going. There were quite a few of those, and he was anonymously donating to give them tour support, just to keep them on the label so that they could just get out there a little bit longer and let the world discover them. He was tremendously generous in that way, but he did it anonymously because he did not want thanks and praise. He wanted the work done.
And that does it for this episode of the QI Podcast. I'd like to thank Dr. Susan Rogers for giving us time out of her busy schedule, being that she's a professor at the Berklee College of Music. Also, special shout out to Angry Bull Productions for putting this together. If you like this episode or any of our previous episodes from previous seasons or this season, please give us a shout out at our email, theqipodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit us up at our various social medias, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the QI Podcast. I am your host, DJ 10th Power. Be sure to tune in 2 weeks to our season finale and our final conversation with Dr. Susan Rogers. Until then, I will see you on the next episode.